October 15, 1962. 3:27 a.m. The sound of 12 gunshots echoed through the empty streets of Harlem like thunder in a graveyard. When the smoke cleared and the blood stopped flowing, 12 men lay dead. Not just any 12 men. 12 made members of New York's most powerful crime families. And standing over their bodies, his .45 still smoking in his hand, was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy Johnson. The man who just declared war on the entire Italian mob with a single night of calculated violence that would reshape organized crime in America forever. But this wasn't random violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was surgical precision. This was 4 years in the making. This was revenge so perfectly orchestrated, so brutally efficient, that even the FBI files on that night are still classified today. Because what Bumpy Johnson did on October 15, 1962, didn't just kill 12 mobsters. It killed an entire way of thinking about power, territory, and respect in the criminal underworld. To understand the magnitude of what happened that night, you need to understand what those 12 bodies represented. These weren't street soldiers. These weren't button men looking to make their bones. These were capos. Lieutenants. Men who controlled territories worth millions. Men who thought they were untouchable. Men who had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The story begins 4 years earlier, in 1958. Harlem was changing. The neighborhood that had been the cultural heart of Black America was under siege from forces both external and internal. The Italian families had been circling like vultures for years, waiting for their moment to swoop in and claim the most lucrative racket in the neighborhood. The numbers game. Every day, thousands of Harlem residents would place small bets, nickels and dimes mostly, on a 3-digit number. It seemed innocent enough. Poor folks dreaming of hitting it big. But those nickels and dimes added up to millions of dollars a year. And millions of dollars attracted the attention of very dangerous men. The 5 families had tried everything to muscle in on Bumpy's territory. They'd sent negotiators with briefcases full of cash. Bumpy had sent them back empty-handed. They'd sent enforcers with brass knuckles and baseball bats. Bumpy had sent them back in ambulances. They'd tried bribing politicians and police commissioners. But Bumpy's network ran deeper than their money could reach. By 1958, the families were getting desperate, and desperate criminals make fatal errors in judgment. Vincent Gigante, the man they called the Chin, was the first to suggest what everyone else was thinking but nobody wanted to say out loud. They needed to eliminate Bumpy Johnson permanently. Not scare him. Not intimidate him. Kill him. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because killing Bumpy Johnson wasn't like killing some street corner dealer or small-time bookmaker. Bumpy was connected. He had relationships that stretched from the governor's mansion in Albany to the back rooms of Congress. He had friends in the NYPD, the FBI, and even the CIA. More importantly, he had something the Italian families never had in Harlem. He had genuine respect from the community. When the Gigante crew finally made their move in September 1958, they thought they were being clever. They'd identified Big Sam Foster, Bumpy's most trusted bodyguard, as a potential weak link. Sam had gambling debts. His mother needed expensive medical treatment. His younger brother had gotten mixed up with some rough characters and needed money to get out of town quickly. The Italians saw opportunity. They approached Sam with an offer that seemed too good to refuse. $50,000. More money than Sam had ever seen in his life. All he had to do was betray the man who had treated him like a brother for 5 years. What happened next has been told and retold in barbershops and pool halls across Harlem for 60 years, but the real story, the complete story, has never been fully revealed until now. Because what nobody knew, what the FBI files won't tell you, is that Bumpy Johnson had been expecting the betrayal for weeks. He'd seen the signs. Sam's nervous energy. His sudden interest in taking point on security details. His questions about Bumpy's schedule that seemed just a little too casual, a little too specific. But here's where Bumpy's genius showed itself. Instead of confronting Sam directly, instead of eliminating the threat, Bumpy decided to use the betrayal as an opportunity. He would let Sam think the plan was working. He would let the Italians think they had finally found their opening. And then, when they were completely committed, when they had invested everything in their strategy, he would turn their own plan against them. The night of September 12, 1958, Bumpy walked into Lennox Lounge knowing exactly what was going to happen. He'd spent 3 weeks preparing. The gun Sam thought was loaded with live ammunition had been loaded with blanks. The room that seemed empty of Bumpy's people was actually filled with them, hidden in shadows and behind curtains. The backup plan Sam thought he had was actually another layer of Bumpy's strategy. When Sam pulled the trigger and heard only a click, when Bumpy turned around with that cold smile and said those 5 words that became legend, "I've been counting on you," Sam realized he wasn't just caught in a trap. He was caught in a masterpiece of manipulation that had been months in the making. But that was just the beginning. Because Bumpy wasn't interested in just surviving the assassination attempt. He was interested in sending a message so loud, so clear, that nobody would ever mistake his intentions again. Over the next 4 years, from 1958 to 1962, Bumpy Johnson orchestrated what intelligence experts would later call one of the most sophisticated counterintelligence operations ever conducted by a non-state actor. He didn't just gather information about his enemies. He infiltrated their organizations. He turned their own people against them. He learned their habits, their weaknesses, their secrets. And most importantly, he waited. Because revenge served cold isn't just more satisfying. It's more effective. By 1962, Bumpy had compiled dossiers on every major player in the 5 Families Harlem operation. He knew which capo was skimming money from his crew's earnings. He knew which lieutenant was sleeping with his boss's wife. He knew which soldier was secretly feeding information to the FBI. He knew where they lived, where they ate, where they felt safe. And he used all of this information to craft a plan so audacious, so perfectly timed, that when it was executed, it would eliminate not just individuals, but the entire power structure the families had built in Harlem. The 12 men who died on October 15, 1962, weren't chosen randomly. Each one represented a specific link in the chain of command that the families had established to control Harlem's rackets. Anthony Carfano, the Lucchese family's point man for numbers operations. Michael Spinelli, the Genovese crew chief who oversaw loan sharking and protection rackets. Tommy Eboli, who coordinated drug distribution from Italian suppliers to street dealers. Each man was a key component in a machine designed to extract wealth from Harlem and funnel it to mob coffers in Little Italy and Brooklyn. But here's what made Bumpy's plan so brilliant. He didn't just kill these men. He killed them simultaneously, in locations spread across Manhattan, using methods that sent very specific messages. Carfano was found in his car outside his favorite restaurant, shot execution style. The message, "Your comfortable routines won't protect you." Spinelli was killed in his own office, behind doors he thought were secure. The message, "Nowhere is safe." Eboli was eliminated while surrounded by his own bodyguards, none of whom saw the shooter coming. The message, "Your people can't protect you." The precision required to coordinate 12 simultaneous assassinations across a major city is staggering. It required intelligence networks, timing devices, communication systems, and most importantly, absolute loyalty from dozens of participants. The fact that Bumpy Johnson was able to orchestrate this operation while maintaining complete secrecy demonstrates a level of organizational sophistication that rivaled anything the FBI or CIA was doing at the time. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the October 15th operation wasn't the killings themselves. It was what happened afterward. Within hours of the bodies being discovered, every Italian operation in Harlem simply stopped. Numbers runners who had been working for mob-connected operations suddenly found themselves working directly for Bumpy's organization. Loan sharks who had been collecting for family capos were now collecting for neighborhood banks that answered to Bumpy. Drug dealers who had been moving Italian heroin were now moving nothing at all, because Bumpy Johnson had a strict policy against narcotics in his territory. The 5 families found themselves in an impossible position. They had lost 12 key operators in a single night. Their entire Harlem infrastructure had collapsed. And they had no idea how it happened or who else might be compromised. The paranoia that followed was almost as destructive as the original attack. Family members started suspecting each other. Capos began questioning the loyalty of their lieutenants. The trust that held these organizations together began to crumble. Frank Costello, who by 1962 was considered the most powerful mob boss in New York, called an emergency meeting of all 5 family heads. The topic wasn't revenge. It wasn't retaliation. It was survival. Because what Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated on October 15th wasn't just superior firepower or better intelligence. He had demonstrated that the rules the families thought governed organized crime in New York didn't apply to him. The meeting took place in a private dining room at a restaurant in Little Italy. 5 men who controlled billions of dollars in illegal activities, who had politicians and judges on their payrolls, who commanded armies of soldiers and associates, sat around a table trying to figure out how one man in Harlem had checkmated them all. The conversation, according to FBI surveillance transcripts that weren't declassified until 1995, was unlike anything agents had ever recorded from these men. Vincent Giganti, usually the most aggressive voice in any room, was subdued, almost philosophical. "This isn't about territory anymore," he said. "This is about survival. Johnson didn't just kill 12 of our people. He killed the idea that we're untouchable." Carlo Gambino, known for his strategic thinking, was even more direct. "We underestimated him," he admitted. "We thought we were dealing with a street-level operator. We were wrong. Johnson is playing a different game than we are, and he's been playing it longer than we realized." But it was Frank Costello who articulated what everyone in the room understood but nobody wanted to say. "Johnson isn't just defending his territory," Costello observed. "He's expanding his influence. Every operation we shut down in Harlem, he's replacing with something better organized, more efficient, more connected to the community. We're not just losing money. We're losing relevance." The truth was even more complex than the family heads realized. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just eliminating competition. He was implementing a completely different model of organized crime. Where the Italian families extracted wealth from communities through fear and exploitation, Bumpy was building a system that generated wealth by protecting and empowering those communities. His numbers operations weren't just gambling enterprises. They were informal banking systems that provided credit and financial services to people who couldn't access traditional banks. His protection services weren't just extortion rackets. They were genuine security operations that kept predatory businesses and corrupt officials from victimizing Harlem residents. His political connections weren't just sources of immunity from prosecution. They were channels for improving schools, creating jobs, and bringing legitimate businesses to the neighborhood. This wasn't just crime. This was nation building. And that's what made the October 15th operation so historically significant. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just eliminating rival criminals. He was eliminating an entire approach to criminal organization that was based on exploitation and replacing it with one based on community investment. The 12 bodies weren't just casualties of a turf war. They were symbols of an old way of thinking about power that was being swept away by something more sophisticated and more sustainable. The immediate aftermath of October 15th saw changes that rippled far beyond Harlem. Police precincts that had been taking money from Italian operations suddenly found their funding sources dried up. Politicians who had been answering to family interests started receiving different kinds of pressure from different kinds of people. Legitimate businesses that had been paying protection money to mob-connected operations found themselves dealing with more professional, more reasonable representatives of what amounted to a shadow government. By the end of 1962, just 2 months after the 12 assassinations, Harlem had transformed into something unprecedented in American organized crime. It was still a center of illegal activity. Numbers games, loan sharking, and various forms of gambling continued to operate. But these operations were now integrated into a broader economic system that actually strengthened the community rather than parasitically feeding off it. Children who had been dropping out of school to run numbers were now staying in school while working part-time in legitimate businesses that were funded by gambling profits. Families who had been trapped in cycles of debt to loan sharks were now borrowing money at reasonable rates from community credit unions that were capitalized by illegal enterprises. Small business owners who had been victimized by protection rackets were now receiving actual security services from organizations that had a vested interest in the neighborhood's prosperity. The model that Bumpy Johnson created in Harlem after October 15, 1962, would eventually be studied by sociologists, economists, and political scientists as an example of how criminal organizations can evolve into parallel governance structures. But in 1962, all the five families knew was that their most profitable territory had been transformed overnight into something they couldn't understand and couldn't compete with. The final irony of the October 15th operation is that it succeeded so completely that it eventually made itself obsolete. By demonstrating that organized crime could operate as a community development tool rather than a community exploitation system, Bumpy Johnson had created something that was too sophisticated and too successful to remain purely criminal. Within a decade, many of the services his organization provided would be taken over by legitimate businesses and government programs. The credit unions would become real banks. The security services would become legitimate private security companies. The political networks would become official community advocacy organizations. But on that night in October 1962, when 12 bodies lay cooling in morgues across Manhattan, none of that was apparent. What was apparent was that the balance of power in New York organized crime had shifted permanently. The Italian family's dreams of controlling Harlem had died with those 12 men. And in their place, something new had been born. Something that would change not just how criminals operated in American cities, but how communities could organize themselves to resist exploitation and build genuine prosperity. The gunshots that echoed through Harlem on October 15, 1962, didn't just announce the death of 12 mobsters. They announced the birth of a new model of power that would influence urban politics, community organization, and even legitimate business practices for generations to come. Bumpy Johnson hadn't just killed his enemies. He had killed an entire way of thinking about crime, community, and power. And in its place, he had built something that would outlast him, outlast his enemies, and outlast everyone who witnessed that remarkable night when 12 gunshots changed the rules of power in America forever. But the real test of Bumpy's new model would come not in the immediate aftermath of that October night, but in the months and years that followed, as word of what had happened in Harlem spread through the networks of organized crime across America. The story was told in whispers in Chicago's South Side, in Detroit's East End, in Philadelphia's North Side, and in Los Angeles's Watts District. Each telling added new details, some true, some embellished, but all carrying the same essential message: the old rules were dead, and something new was being born. The Italian family's response was swift but fragmented. In Chicago, the outfit's leadership held emergency meetings, debating whether to send soldiers east to avenge their fallen New York associates. But Sam Giancana himself reportedly put an end to such talk with a simple observation. "You don't fight a war you can't win in territory you don't understand against people who have nothing left to lose." The Chicago mob would maintain its distance from Harlem affairs, a decision that would save countless lives on both sides. Philadelphia's Angelo Bruno took a different approach, attempting to reach out through intermediaries to establish some form of détente with Johnson's organization. Bruno understood something that many of his contemporaries missed. The events in Harlem weren't just about territory or money, they were about a fundamental shift in how power operated in America's urban centers. His emissaries, carefully chosen black intermediaries with ties to both worlds, carried messages of respect and offers of mutual non-interference. These negotiations, conducted in barbershops and church basements, established a template for coexistence that would influence organized crime relations across multiple cities. Meanwhile, in Harlem itself, the transformation continued at street level. The numbers operation that had once been fragmented among dozens of small operators and Italian overseers became a sophisticated network that functioned almost like a parallel banking system for the community. The daily ritual of placing bets had evolved into something far more complex. Residents could take out small loans, make payments on major purchases, and even arranged for money to be sent to family members in the South through the same runners who collected numbers slips. Johnson's enforcers, no longer simple muscle for hire, had become community mediators. When disputes arose between neighbors, between customers and shopkeepers, or between landlords and tenants, people increasingly turned to these men for resolution rather than to police who were seen as outsiders at best, enemies at worst. This wasn't vigilante justice in any conventional sense, but rather a sophisticated system of community-based conflict resolution that drew on both street credibility and genuine understanding of local conditions and customs. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the way young people in Harlem began to see their options and possibilities. Where once the choice seemed to be between grinding poverty in legitimate work or dangerous servitude to Italian overlords, now there were examples of black men who had built real power, real wealth, and real respect through their own efforts and intelligence. This didn't eliminate crime. Indeed, competition among young hustlers sometimes became fierce, but it changed the nature of criminal ambition from desperate survival to strategic empire building. These changes attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Sociologists from Columbia University began conducting quiet research in Harlem, trying to understand how a community that had been written off by most experts as irredeemably chaotic had suddenly developed such sophisticated informal institutions. Their preliminary findings suggested that Johnson's organization had essentially created what they termed indigenous governance structures that filled gaps left by the failure of official city services. The academic interest wasn't purely scholarly. By 1963, urban planners and social workers were beginning to realize that traditional approaches to urban poverty and crime weren't working. The riots in Birmingham and other southern cities had focused national attention on racial inequality, but northern cities faced different but equally serious challenges. Some progressive thinkers began to wonder if there were lessons to be learned from what was happening in Harlem, even if they couldn't publicly endorse the methods that had created the situation. This attention brought new pressures. Federal agencies that had largely ignored Harlem's internal affairs as long as they remained contained within the community began to take notice as word spread about the sophisticated organization that had emerged. The FBI's files on Johnson, already substantial, expanded dramatically as agents tried to understand whether they were dealing with simple criminal activity or something that might challenge federal authority in more fundamental ways. The pressure intensified when similar patterns began emerging in other cities. In Detroit, a numbers operator named Big Joe Williams had consolidated several previously Italian-controlled operations using tactics clearly inspired by the Harlem model. In Philadelphia, a consortium of black entrepreneurs had taken control of several legitimate businesses previously dominated by Italian families, using a combination of economic leverage and community support that mirrored Johnson's approach. But perhaps the most significant development was happening in the realm of legitimate business. Young black entrepreneurs, inspired by the example of building independent economic power, began creating businesses that served their communities without requiring approval or partnership with white-dominated institutions. These ranged from small storefront operations to more ambitious ventures, record labels that promoted R&B and soul music, construction companies that specialized in renovating Harlem brownstones, and eventually even small banks and investment groups that operated primarily within the black community. The success of these legitimate enterprises created a virtuous cycle. As more black-owned businesses prospered, they provided both employment opportunities and examples of successful entrepreneurship. This, in turn, made it easier for talented young people to choose legitimate paths to success rather than criminal ones. The line between legal and illegal activities remained blurred. Many legitimate businesses relied on capital that originated in the numbers operations, and many entrepreneurs maintained friendly relationships with Johnson's organization, but the overall direction was toward greater economic independence and self-sufficiency. This evolution wasn't without its complications and contradictions. The same organizational skills that had enabled Johnson to outmaneuver the Italian families also made his operation increasingly attractive to federal law enforcement as a target. The very success of his model made it impossible to ignore, and by 1964, multiple federal agencies were coordinating efforts to understand and ultimately dismantle what they saw as a dangerous challenge to established authority. The investigation revealed the extent to which Johnson's influence had grown beyond simple criminal enterprise. Bank records showed that businesses associated with his organization were responsible for a significant portion of property purchases and renovations in central Harlem. Employment records indicated that these businesses provided jobs for hundreds of residents, many of whom had previously been considered unemployable by mainstream employers. Tax records, where they existed, showed that the community was generating and retaining wealth at levels that surprised even sympathetic observers. But the federal attention also revealed the inherent vulnerabilities in Johnson's model. Unlike the Italian families, which could rely on ethnic solidarity and family connections that transcended geographical boundaries, Johnson's organization was ultimately dependent on community support that could be fragile in the face of sustained pressure. The same community ties that had made his rise possible could potentially be turned against him if federal authorities could convince residents that their interests lay in cooperation with law enforcement rather than continued support for indigenous leadership. The tension came to a head during the summer of 1964, as civil rights protests across the South created a new national conversation about race, power, and justice. Federal authorities saw an opportunity to present the dismantling of Johnson's organization as part of a broader effort to bring law and order to American cities, while Johnson and his supporters argued that federal intervention represented exactly the kind of external control that the community had fought to escape. The philosophical implications of this conflict extended far beyond Harlem. At its core, the question was whether communities had the right to organize themselves according to their own values and traditions, even when those methods fell outside conventional legal frameworks. It was a question that would resonate through subsequent decades as other marginalized communities faced similar choices between accommodation with external authority and the development of independent power structures. The federal investigation that began in earnest that autumn would reveal the intricate web of relationships that had allowed Johnson's influence to flourish for so long. What emerged was not simply a story of corruption, but a complex portrait of how power operated in communities where traditional institutions had failed to provide adequate representation or services. The numbers alone told part of the story. Federal agents documented that Johnson's organization had mediated over 3,000 disputes in the previous 5 years, ranging from landlord-tenant conflicts to domestic violence cases, creating an informal justice system that operated parallel to official courts. This parallel system had developed its own protocols and precedents. Community members would bring their grievances to designated locations throughout Harlem, where Johnson's associates would hear testimonies, investigate claims, and render decisions that were generally accepted by all parties involved. The process bore little resemblance to formal legal proceedings, relying instead on community knowledge, personal relationships, and an understanding of local dynamics that outsiders often found impenetrable. Federal observers struggled to categorize what they encountered. Traditional law enforcement frameworks provided no clear way to assess the legitimacy of community-based dispute resolution, particularly when those systems operated outside established legal channels but enjoyed widespread popular support. The investigation files, later made public through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed the confusion among federal agents who found themselves documenting activities that seemed simultaneously beneficial to community welfare and potentially problematic from a legal standpoint. The broader implications of this investigation extended into questions about the nature of democracy itself. If a community could organize itself effectively outside traditional political structures, what did that mean for the relationship between citizens and the state? The Johnson case became a touchstone for these discussions, cited in academic papers and policy debates for decades to come as an example of the tensions inherent in American federalism. As winter approached, the pressure on Johnson intensified, but so did community support for his leadership, setting the stage for a confrontation that would ultimately reshape how Americans thought about community organization, federal authority, and the complex relationship between law and justice in urban America.